Welcome back. Tonight we're opening a different kind of casebook, a collection of true crime stories that remain chilling to this day. Some are solved, others remain haunting mysteries. Either way, they'll stay with you long after the night ends. Let's dive into story 1 from our true crime files. Close your eyes and picture this. A small town where mornings are quiet and life feels predictable. Children walk to school in groups, waving to neighbors, backpacks bouncing as they take the same familiar path every day. But in this story, one boy took that same walk and never made it. No struggle was heard. No one saw him cry for help. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed him whole. This is the haunting case of the boy who vanished on his way to school and was never seen again. It began just like any other weekday morning. The boy woke up early, had breakfast at the kitchen table, and pulled on his school clothes, neatly ironed, his shoes polished the night before. His mother tucked a sandwich into his lunchbox, slipped it into his bag, and gave him a quick hug. Neighbors later remembered him smiling as he stepped outside. The streets were alive with morning routines, car doors slamming, dogs barking, the hum of radios playing from open windows. The school was only a short distance away, 10 minutes by foot, a walk he had taken countless times before. A safe walk through streets where everyone knew each other. At exactly 8:15 a.m., he left the house. He waved to a neighbor across the street. At 8:20, another neighbor thought they saw him walking past the corner shop. And then he was gone. When he didn't show up at school, the teachers assumed he was late. But when his desk sat empty long after the bell rang, they began to worry. By midday, the school called his parents. Panic set in instantly. His father left work. His mother ran to the school, her voice trembling as she asked if they'd checked everywhere. Police were contacted within hours, and a search was organized. Volunteers lined the streets. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned fields and rivers nearby. Yet there was no backpack, no clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as though the boy had simply vanished into thin air. This is the detail that still chills investigators decades later. The walk was so short. The number of eyes on that road should have made it impossible for a child to disappear without someone noticing, and yet no one did. Police began knocking on doors, questioning anyone who had been outside that morning. Some recalled a suspicious car idling near the school, though no one wrote down the license plate. Others claimed they saw a man watching from a distance, but descriptions of him varied wildly. Every lead seemed promising at first, and then collapsed under scrutiny. Tips came in by the hundreds, but they only pulled investigators in circles. The local community grew restless. Parents kept their children at home. Mothers walked in groups, escorting kids to school. Detectives even turned their suspicions inward. Was it someone the boy knew? A family member? A teacher? The questions tore through the neighborhood, planting seeds of distrust. Families who had once shared dinners and barbecues now eyed each other with suspicion. To this day, no definitive answer has ever been found, but 4 theories continue to haunt the case. Theory 1, the stranger abduction. A car pulls up, the door opens, the boy trusts the driver, or is forced inside. Within seconds, he's gone. It is quick, brutal, and tragically common in cases like this. Theory 2, someone he knew. Perhaps it wasn't a stranger at all. What if it was a face he trusted, a neighbor offering a ride, a family acquaintance who betrayed him? That would explain why there was no struggle. Theory 3, a runaway. Investigators briefly considered the possibility that he left of his own accord, but his age, his close relationship with his family, and the lack of preparation made this unlikely. Theory 4, a cover-up or failure. Some whisper that mistakes were made early in the investigation, evidence ignored, leads mishandled, police unwilling to admit how quickly they lost track of the case. If true, it means the answers may have been there all along, but were missed forever. The disappearance shattered the boy's family. His mother, unable to sleep, kept a light on in the front window every night for years, hoping that if he was still alive, he might one day see it and come home. His father searched tirelessly, speaking to reporters, pushing the case into headlines, refusing to let the world forget his son. The community, too, was changed forever. Parents who once felt safe now clutched their children's hands tighter. Neighbors locked doors in daylight, and children were forbidden from walking to school alone. The case became a ghost that hovered over the town, a wound that never healed. Decades later, the case is still discussed in hushed tones. Documentaries have been made, books written, podcasts recorded. DNA testing has re-examined evidence. Old tips resurface, but the truth remains hidden. Every year, anniversaries of the boy's disappearance bring news articles, reminding the world that he is still missing. His face, frozen in childhood, is reprinted beside age progression sketches that imagine what he might look like today. And yet, nothing. No closure, no ending. Just the haunting silence of a boy who walked down a familiar street one morning and never came home. And that concludes Story 1, a mystery that proves sometimes the darkest stories don't happen in abandoned houses at midnight. They unfold in broad daylight on the safest of streets and leave behind questions that may never be answered. And now, let's turn the page to Story 2, another chilling case from our true crime files. If Story 1 was about a boy who vanished into silence, this story is about someone who refused to vanish, and instead slipped right out of prison in a disguise so strange, it's still remembered to this day. Prisons are supposed to be the one place where danger is contained. Massive walls, towers with watchmen, metal bars that slam shut at night, every detail designed to keep what is inside. But this story is proof of something uncomfortable, that no wall is high enough and no gate is strong enough if someone understands how to trick the people guarding them. Because in this case, a convicted killer didn't dig a tunnel. He didn't scale the fences. He didn't even fight his way out. He walked through the gates, disguised as a woman. The man at the center of this story was not just another prisoner. He was serving time for murder, a violent crime that had horrified his community. Inside prison, he quickly gained a reputation, not for fighting, not for strength, but for watching, always watching. Guards noticed how he studied routines, which officers were alert, which were lazy, who let small details slip. He watched how food was delivered, how supplies were logged, how visitors came in and left. Most prisoners sink into the rhythm of prison life, the sameness of every day. He didn't. He treated prison like a puzzle with one solution: escape. Where most saw barriers, he saw opportunities. Visitors came and went every week, families, lawyers, friends, hundreds of people passing through the gates. Security checked them carefully on the way in, but the way out was different. Leaving was easy. Guards didn't question people leaving. After all, why would they? No one escapes by walking out the front door, unless they look like someone who belongs there. And so the seed of an idea took root. Not a dramatic breakout, not a riot or a tunnel, but a disguise. The preparation was slow, painfully slow, but he had time, years of it. He began collecting small pieces: a wig smuggled in through contacts, women's clothing, borrowed, stolen, sometimes even crafted from altered prison laundry, makeup, bits of fabric, small accessories, anything to complete the illusion. He practiced in secret, trying the disguise in his cell, testing how he looked in the small mirror, learning how to walk differently, how to carry himself with softer movements, how to change his voice just enough to pass with a quick nod from a distracted guard. This wasn't a desperate plan. It was a performance, rehearsed over and over again. The day itself began like any other. Visitors filed into the prison, conversations murmured in the visitation hall. Guards leaned on walls, half watching, half bored. The killer waited, and when visitors began leaving, he slipped into the stream of people. He was dressed in full disguise, a long skirt, a blouse that hid his frame, a wig that covered his hair, glasses that disguised his eyes, a touch of makeup to soften his features, even a handbag hanging from his arm. Those who later saw the photographs of his disguise said it was unsettling, not because it was beautiful or convincing, but because it was just enough to trick a quick glance. The human brain, when it expects to see a woman, doesn't always question the details. He walked with the group, head slightly lowered, steps calm. A guard glanced, nodded, and waved him through. The gates opened, and just like that, he was gone. The escape wasn't noticed right away. Hours passed before guards realized his cell was empty. When they counted heads and came up short, panic erupted. A murderer was free. Sirens blared. The prison locked down. Phones rang through police stations across the country. Newspapers rushed to print the shocking headline, "Killer escapes prison dressed as woman." Families were terrified. Citizens kept doors locked and eyes sharp. Some refused to let their children walk outside. The manhunt began. Roadblocks on highways, searches in towns and cities, police scanning bus stations and train depots. But the disguise made everything more difficult. Witnesses reported seeing a woman who looked strange, a little too tall, a little too rough around the edges. But by the time police arrived, he was gone again. Days turned into a tense hunt. Tips poured in, some reliable, most false. One woman swore she had spoken to him in a grocery store. Another claimed she saw him boarding a train. Dozens of reports flooded in, and everyone had to be checked. But the truth was that the disguise worked better than anyone wanted to admit. People simply weren't sure what they were looking for. A man, a woman, someone in between. This confusion bought him precious time. In the end, it wasn't police brilliance that brought him down. It was a mistake. Accounts differ. Some say it was the way he walked, heavy steps that didn't match the disguise. Others say it was his voice, too deep when he forgot to soften it. And some whisper that it was arrogance, that he felt untouchable, and so he let his guard slip. Whatever the truth, someone recognized him, and once suspicion fell, the disguise crumbled. He was arrested, dragged back to prison, and placed under tighter watch than ever before. The escape shocked not only the public, but prison systems worldwide. How could something so absurd have actually worked? How could hardened guards be fooled by a wig and a dress? For weeks, newspapers mocked the system. Politicians demanded answers. Families demanded better protection. And prisons changed. New rules were introduced. More thorough searches, stricter visitation procedures, identity checks for everyone leaving. But no amount of change erased the memory of that day. The day a killer walked through prison gates, not with violence, not with force, but with deception. And that is what makes this story so chilling, because it wasn't just an escape. It was proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's a trick and a disguise. And that concludes story 2, the tale of the killer who escaped prison dressed as a woman. From the boy who vanished into silence, to the murderer who slipped into a disguise and walked into freedom. Each file reminds us that safety is fragile, and sometimes the darkest stories are the ones that actually happened. And now, we move to story 3, another haunting case from our true crime files. If the last story showed us how a killer slipped past the walls of a prison, this one takes us somewhere very different. Into a day meant for joy, a day planned for love, that instead became one of the most chilling mysteries of all. A day when a bride was supposed to walk down the aisle, but never did. A wedding day is supposed to be perfect. Months of planning go into it. Flowers ordered, food prepared, music rehearsed, dresses fitted. The family gathers, guests travel long distances, and all eyes rest on the bride. But in this story, the moment everyone waited for never came. Her gown was ready. The church bells rang. The groom stood waiting, and the guests filled the pews, whispering in anticipation. Yet the bride herself was gone. No footsteps down the aisle, no vows spoken. Just an empty space where she should have been. This is the chilling tale of the bride who vanished on her wedding day. The day began like any other wedding day, full of nervous excitement. At her family's home, the bride prepared in the company of her closest friends. Her hair was pinned carefully into place, her veil laid out on a chair, and her white gown hung neatly by the window, glowing in the morning light. Photographs were taken, laughter echoed through the rooms, and everyone remarked on how radiant she looked. The groom, miles away, straightened his tie and rehearsed his vows. Guests began to arrive at the church. The choir warmed their voices. The air carried the feeling of celebration, a sense that something special was about to unfold. There was no sign, no warning, that the day was about to turn into a nightmare. According to the timeline, the bride was supposed to leave her home just before noon. She hugged her family, waved to neighbors, and stepped outside, her dress carefully carried, her bouquet in hand. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. Somewhere between her doorstep and the church, she disappeared. Guests at the ceremony waited, whispering as the minutes stretched into hours. The groom stood at the altar, nervous at first, then confused, then pale with dread. At first, people joked. Maybe she was late, maybe she had cold feet. But as time dragged on, the jokes faded. Fear crept in. Something was wrong. What was meant to be a celebration dissolved into chaos. The family and groom rushed from the church into the streets, calling her name, checking nearby roads, searching parks and hotels. Guests dressed in formal clothes found themselves combing alleyways and sidewalks. The police were called before the day was even over. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was a bride vanishing in her gown on the very day she was meant to marry. The search turned desperate. Officers questioned taxi drivers, bus stations, train depots. Every road leading out of the town was watched. Yet nothing was found. No trace of her gown, no bouquet dropped on the street, no witnesses of a struggle. It was as though she had stepped out of her home and melted into thin air. The investigation dug into every possibility. Detectives interviewed her bridesmaids. Had she said anything unusual that morning? Had she expressed doubt, fear, hesitation? None could recall anything but joy. The groom was questioned. Investigators always begin with those closest. Was there a fight? Was there a secret? His devastation seemed genuine, but still, suspicion lingered in whispers. Old boyfriends were looked at, jealous rivals considered, family disputes examined, but none of it led to answers. The trail was ice cold from the very first hour. And so, like many unsolved mysteries, theories began to grow. Theory 1. The runaway bride. Some believe she chose to vanish. Cold feet, pressure, the fear of marriage. Perhaps she slipped away intentionally, leaving behind her dress, her family, and her old life. But if so, where did she go? And why has no trace of her ever surfaced? Theory 2. Abduction. Others believe she was taken by someone who knew her routine, who waited for the exact moment she stepped outside. An opportunist. Or perhaps someone she trusted enough to approach without fear. Theory 3. Foul play from within. Dark rumors suggested that someone close to her, maybe even within the wedding itself, wanted to stop the marriage. Was there jealousy? Was there betrayal? Without evidence, this theory remained speculation, but it never faded. Theory 4. a hidden accident, and finally, the possibility of a tragic accident. Perhaps she fell or was struck by a vehicle, and someone covered it up in fear. A mistake turned into silence. Each theory held fragments of possibility. None gave closure. The disappearance captured national headlines. Newspapers printed her photograph in her wedding gown, the smiling young woman who was supposed to begin a new life, but instead became a ghost of questions. The groom was left broken. Some say he never recovered, forever haunted by the moment he waited at the altar and realized she would not come. Guests who had gathered to celebrate love went home shaken, whispering rumors that would live for decades. Years passed. Some claimed to see her in distant towns. Others swore she had begun a new life under a false name. But there was never proof, never evidence, never a single answer. Her wedding day, remembered not for vows or joy, but for the mystery that turned a day of celebration into one of the strangest disappearances in history. And that concludes Story 3, the tale of the bride who vanished on her wedding day. From the boy who disappeared on his way to school, to the killer who walked out of prison in disguise, and now a bride who stepped outside her door and was never seen again. Each story leaves us with the same lesson, that life can turn from joy to darkness in the blink of an eye, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries don't come from legends or folklore, but from the moments we expect to be the happiest. And now, we move to Story 4, another disturbing entry in our true crime files. If a bride can vanish on her wedding day, this story takes us somewhere different, into a place we are all supposed to feel safe, a doctor's office. Because in this case, the very person meant to heal was the one causing death. Doctors are some of the most trusted people in our lives. We go to them in moments of weakness. We let them diagnose our bodies, prescribe our medicine, even decide if we live or die. But what happens when that trust is betrayed? What happens when the healer becomes the killer? This is the chilling story of a respected physician, admired in his town, trusted by his patients, who began poisoning the very people who came to him for help. In his community, he was seen as a man of science, intelligence, and compassion. His white coat was a symbol of reassurance. Families called him not just their doctor, but their friend. He attended community events, smiled at children, carried himself with confidence. He seemed like the last person who could ever bring harm. But behind the professional mask, something darker lived. A fascination with control. A desire not just to heal, but to hold the power of life and death in his hands. At first, it may have been curiosity, an experiment with poisons, doses, reactions. But once he realized how easy it was to hide a crime beneath the mask of medicine, the killings began. The first patient's death raised no alarm. The woman had been ill. The doctor simply signed the papers. Natural causes. Then came another, and another. All ordinary deaths on the surface. Elderly patients, frail bodies, sudden collapses. Families mourned, but they trusted the doctor's word. Who would question him? Each death brought him more confidence. He realized he could decide who lived and who died, and no one would suspect. To the world, he was saving lives, but quietly, in his office, he was ending them. Over time, a strange pattern began to form. Patients who seemed stable, people expected to recover, suddenly died under his care. Their final hours were eerily similar. Sudden weakness, collapse, difficulty breathing, and then silence. The deaths were too frequent, too sudden. At first, only whispers, a nurse mentioning that she found it odd, a colleague raising an eyebrow at yet another funeral. But in a small town, whispers spread, and soon people began to ask the unthinkable. Could the doctor be the cause? Authorities hesitated at first. After all, this was a respected man, but the deaths piled up, and suspicion could no longer be ignored. Investigators began quietly re-examining his cases. They noticed inconsistencies in medical records, vague causes of death, identical descriptions repeated over and over. The most chilling step came when they exhumed the bodies of several patients. Forensic testing revealed the truth: poison, traces of substances no ordinary patient would ever consume, carefully measured, hidden beneath the mask of treatment. The evidence pointed not to chance, not to illness, but to murder, and the man everyone trusted was at the center of it. Why would a doctor, someone sworn to heal, turn to poison? Investigators uncovered several motives. For some victims, it was greed. He manipulated life insurance policies, altered wills, ensuring he benefited from their deaths. For others, it was convenience. Patients who complained too much, who became a burden, were quietly silenced. And for some, it seemed there was no motive at all, beyond the chilling thrill of power, the satisfaction of deciding when a heart stopped beating, the psychology of control. This wasn't just murder, it was betrayal at its deepest level, the violation of ultimate trust. When the truth finally came out, the community was shaken to its core. Families who had trusted him realized their loved ones' deaths had been no accident. He was arrested, tried, and the courtroom became a stage for grief. Witnesses testified. Forensic experts explained the poisons, the patterns, the deception. The doctor sat calmly, almost detached, as the evidence stacked higher and higher against him. Eventually, the verdict was delivered: guilty. His license revoked, his freedom stripped away, his reputation destroyed. He had entered the prison system not as a healer, but as a murderer in a white coat. Even after his sentencing, the questions never stopped. How many patients had he killed? Was the official number the truth, or just the ones investigators could prove? Some estimate his victims in the dozens. Others believe it may have been hundreds, spread quietly over years. The chilling legacy of this case is that it forces us to question trust itself. If even doctors, the people sworn to protect us, can hide poison in their prescriptions, who can we truly trust? It is a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask of menace. Sometimes it wears a smile, a clean white coat, and it waits patiently until it decides the time is right. And that concludes Story 4, the haunting case of the doctor who poisoned his own patients, from a boy who vanished in broad daylight, to a killer who walked free in disguise, to a bride who disappeared before her vows, and now a doctor who turned healing into death. Each file we uncover reminds us that the darkest truths often hide in the places we least expect. And now, let's move to Story 5, another haunting entry in our true crime files. If the last story took us into trust betrayed by a doctor, this one reminds us that time doesn't always bury the truth. Sometimes, decades later, science whispers the answer that people were too early to hear. A small town, late 1970s, a quiet field bordered by maples and long grass. A morning that began with birdsong and ended with sirens. A young woman was found. Her life ended, her name nearly forgotten by time. The case went cold, no suspect, no trial, no justice. Then 40 years later, a lab light flickered over an old box of evidence. A cotton swab, a scrap of fabric, a trace, and science said, "I remember." Her name, for our story, will be Elena, not her real name, out of respect for those who once loved her. She was 19, newly proud of a part-time job at the diner on Miller Road, saving for night classes in design. On her last morning, the air had that early fall crispness, cool enough for a sweater, but warm when the sun stood high. She left the little rental she shared with a friend, locked the door twice, a habit her father had teased her about, and walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop. Witnesses would later describe nothing unusual: a schoolboy with a red lunchbox, a man in a brown jacket reading yesterday's paper, Elena with a canvas bag, hair pinned back, eyes bright with the kind of hope that belongs to people who imagine their life ahead like a map with endless routes. She was seen on the bus. She got off near the diner. She may have stopped for coffee at the corner stand. The owner couldn't be sure. She smiled easily. She did that. And then the record fades. It fades the way old film does. Colors wash out, edges blur. The next thing we know is not her voice, not her step, but the distant arc of police tape, lifted in the wind like a frayed yellow flag. She was found near a tree line beyond County Road 18, where tall grass leaned like tired soldiers and the ground dipped toward a shallow creek. A pair of hikers noticed something white against the green and brown of the underbrush. They thought, at first, it was a sheet. The county deputies arrived, then the state police. Officers stood with notebooks pressed to their chests. A photographer adjusted for the gray light, the kind that erases shadow and makes everything look colder than it is. Forensics in those years was careful but limited. They measured distances, from the road, from a crushed ring of grass, from a torn branch. They collected what they could: cloth fibers, a hair that might have been hers, might have been someone else's, a smear they couldn't identify, and a timeline they couldn't support. The town watched from behind invisible curtains. The diner closed early, and somewhere a mother kept the porch light on. Detectives worked through the familiar ring of suspects, friends, the boyfriend who loved her and suddenly had 1,000 reasons to explain where he'd been, a co-worker who'd once waited too long after closing, a stranger rumored to follow women on Main Street. They took statements in small rooms painted in unkind color. They knocked on doors, wrote down polite answers, and noticed the places where politeness tried to cover what didn't quite fit. Tips arrived like leaves in a storm, plenty and all over the place. A truck seen idling by the creek, the driver never identified. A man with a dog said to be combing the field at dusk. A fight overheard behind the grocery the evening before. Every thread they pulled led to lint. Nothing held. Grief is a quiet builder. It doesn't announce itself so much as assemble its scaffolding in the background. Elena's family tried to make space for ordinary life, even as police phones rang and reporters asked careful questions. Her father maintained the car like he always did, changing the oil on Saturdays. Her mother kept the kitchen as tidy as a chapel, polishing the table until it reflected her own face back at her. Older, somehow, in a short span of weeks. Birthdays felt like rehearsals with the lead missing. Holidays were chairs around a table where conversation moved cautiously, like people stepping on thin ice. Time did not heal. Time only made the wound smarter, teaching it to be quiet in public. Months became seasons, leads dried up. One detective retired, then another. A box labeled with Elena's case number moved from an active shelf to a quieter one. In the 80s, the town grew a new shopping center. In the 90s, a bypass cut 15 minutes off a drive to the city. People moved in, people moved out. The field by County Road 18 flooded twice, froze each winter, and went wild with goldenrod each August. And the case stayed still, but it did not disappear. A single detective, Marta Hale in our telling, kept a note taped inside her locker. Elena K., 1979. Don't forget. She wasn't assigned to the file anymore, but she reread it on rainy days under the fluorescent hum of a station that smelled of coffee and old paper. In 1979, the lab could type blood into broad groups, compare hairs under a microscope, and hope. By the late 80s, DNA profiling existed, but samples from old scenes were often too degraded or too small, sealed in decades-old envelopes that had breathed a little too much air. The evidence in Elena's case included a smear on the fabric of her sweater and a partial undernail scraping, collected by a careful medical examiner who believed, without being certain, that science would someday learn a new language. That belief would take time. It would take better enzymes, cleaner rooms, amplified signals, and patience, the kind that sits in quiet rooms at 2 a.m. and listens for the softest possible yes. 40 years later, a state grant built something that hadn't existed when the first officers stood in that field. A cold case unit. Not glamorous, not large. A few desks, a whiteboard, and a black coffee machine that burned everything it touched. Detective Marta Hale, now grayer at the temples and plain-spoken in the way people become when they've learned that drama doesn't move the needle, asked for Elena's box on day 1. Inside were photographs that had yellowed at the edges, reports typed on ribbon, and clear sleeves holding one sweater, one swab, 2 sealed envelopes, and a property form signed by a man who'd been dead 10 years. Marta set the box on her desk like someone setting a lamp in a dark room. She ran a finger under the tab dividers, and then she called the lab. The lab's new director, Dr. Amir Youssef, believed in the geometry of patience. He was young enough to be excited by technology and old enough to know that most breakthroughs happen slowly. He and his team wore gowns and double gloves and spoke in the shorthand of people who think in microlighters. They didn't promise miracles. They promised the best work they knew how to do. They started with the sweater. Years of storage can complicate everything. Fibers trap air, air carries contaminants, and time is a thief with a friendly face. Still, on the inner cuff, a microscopic flake yielded a tiny profile, partial, fragile, but there, under Elena's fingernails, the story was smaller still. Scraps of keratin, dust, the trace you'd find beneath anyone's hands after a day of living. But in that dust sat a whisper of someone else. It was not enough to name. It was enough to not forget. With newer amplification methods and contamination controls that would have looked like science fiction in 1979, the lab added signal to the faintest notes. Peaks rose on a screen like distant mountains in fog. Some were hers, some were his. They built a partial male profile. Not enough to stand in court by itself, enough to search. They ran it against CODIS, the national database of offender DNA. Nothing, no hit. But that didn't end the story. It only shifted it. Because a new kind of map was being drawn in those years. A map of families. Dr. Youssef suggested a method that had changed other cases: genetic genealogy. You don't need the suspect in a database if you can find their cousins. With permission and careful redaction, they uploaded a version of the profile to a consumer-style genealogy database that works with law enforcement under strict rules. For weeks, the screen showed a handful of distant matches, 4th cousins, maybe 5th. Nothing close, but not nothing. A name surfaced, then another. The lab marked them with quiet circles and handed them to Marta's unit. Marta did not draw straight lines across the whiteboard. She built trees, branch by branch, marriage by marriage, migration by migration. She scrolled old obituaries. She read property deeds. She looked at a 1955 yearbook page where a young man grinned from the football team with a pomaded wave that said, "Once, I was the center of a small world." The tree narrowed slowly to 3 brothers and a cousin who had all lived within 30 miles of Elena in 1979. One brother had died the year after the crime. The timing was odd, but his military records placed him hundreds of miles away. The cousin moved out of state in the early 70s. That left 2 brothers, Ray and Joel, in our telling. Quiet last names, forgettable men who worked with their hands and paid cash for old cars. Both had been interviewed back then, like many men in the area. Both said they didn't know Elena. Both were free to go. Marta opened their old statements, read carefully, and felt the subtle weight that memory leaves when it wants to slide off the page. One brother, Ray, had offered details no one had asked for: the way the creek bent, the kind of shoes he didn't own, the nights he never parked off County Road 18, except once, he'd said. to fix a belt under the hood. People, Marta knew, tell on themselves in spirals. They treat the truth like a hot plate, touch down and pull away. The unit put light surveillance on both brothers. No movies, no music, just the small orchestra of a tale. A car parked far enough away to be mistaken for disinterest. A walk past a coffee shop window. A pause when a man drops a napkin. Ray lived alone in a rented bungalow with aluminum siding and a yard where the grass went a week too long. He drank from a takeout cup most mornings, tossing it into a bin outside his door. He talked to no one. He watched the same channel at 6 p.m. every night. Joel lived with his daughter and her kids. He grilled on Sundays, made loud jokes, and waved to neighbors. He had the careless ease of a man who doesn't know his name sits in anyone else's mouth. Which man was the tree's answer? Which branch carried the old wind? On a cold Thursday, the team did what cold case teams do when the law allows it, a trash pull. Once the bin sat at the curb, the space of privacy ended. They took discarded coffee lids, a tissue, a fork and a paper sleeve. At the lab, late, the room dim and the machines murmuring. Dr. Yusuf and his tech, Kendra, worked carefully. Coffee lid first. Nothing useful. Tissue next. Mixed but promising. Then the fork sleeve. A clean profile stepped into the light. Male, related to the known tree. They paired it with Elena's partial and watched the peaks align like two pieces of a torn postcard, finding each other after years apart. Not just related, not a cousin, a match. The math was not small. It was the kind of number that makes jurors lean forward. One in the many billions sort of certainty that turns guesswork into a road. Marta doesn't remember the drive, not really. She remembers her hands were calm and the road was clear. She remembers the winter light against the aluminum siding. She remembers Ray opening the door wearing an old sweater that smelled faintly of solvent. "Ray," she said, showing the badge like an introduction to weather. "We're reopening some cases from the 70s. Could we talk?" He invited them in. Men like Ray sometimes do. He chose a chair against a wall and kept his hands in his lap. She asked him about the old creek road and he shrugged. He said he hadn't been there much. He said he didn't know the girl. Marta let silence do a little work. Then she asked if he'd mind giving a cheek swab to rule himself out. There is a moment in some interviews where the eyes decide before the mouth does. His did. They flinched, little thing, and then he smiled like a man reading a script typed by someone whose typewriter was missing vowels. He asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. The warrant began. The DNA from the warrant matched the trash pull. The trash pull matched the partial under Elena's nails and the trace on her sweater. The affidavit ran 21 pages. The judge signed. Ray was arrested on a Saturday morning. Neighbors watched from windows cracked just enough to feel like participation. A boy on a bike circled twice, then 3 times, then was called inside by a voice that wanted him to see and not see. At the station, Ray asked for coffee. Then water. Then time. He gave none of the 3 back. In the presence of counsel, Ray offered a story that turned itself into knots. He'd never known her, except maybe once, he said, she had asked for a ride. Or perhaps he'd seen her at the diner. Or perhaps he'd been out of town entirely. He couldn't quite remember. When told about the DNA, he said the lab made mistakes. When told about the second sample, he said he'd been framed. When told about the under-nail trace, he paused for the first time and looked not at Marta, not at the lawyer, but at the table where the wood grain ran like a small river to the edge. He said nothing then. He said nothing of the field or the creek or the way grass falls back into shape 2 days after someone has laid upon it. He just asked again for water. The courtroom was small and the ceiling a little lower than anyone liked. Reporters sat 2 to a bench, their pens scratching like rain. Elena's family, what remained of it, sat in the first row. A cousin. An uncle with hands that never quite stopped moving. prosecution walked the jury gently through time. They didn't pretend that 1979 could be made new. They honored what could not be recovered, but they showed what could. The chain of custody, the careful seals, the improved methods, the slow miracles of amplification. Dr. Youssef explained peaks and alleles with a teacher's patience. Kendra described gloving twice, changing pipettes, running controls until the machines could have recited the protocol themselves. The defense asked the questions defense must ask. Contamination, coincidence, degraded. They said memory is a liar. They said time is a thief. The prosecution agreed. Time does steal, but not everything, not this. In the end, the jurors didn't stay out long. They returned with faces that wore the weight of what a verdict is, a closing for some, a key turned for others. Guilty, on the charges the law could still carry across the decades. Elena's cousin cried quietly, a sound like fabric torn by careful hands. The uncle took a breath that seemed to last a year and finally let it go. Marta, a person who had learned not to clap for gravity, simply nodded once and closed her eyes. Justice in a cold case doesn't undo the weather. It doesn't re-green the field or return the 40 birthdays that stacked themselves like thin plates in a cupboard no one opened. But it does something. It names. It says, this happened and this person did it. The town learned the lesson small towns always do when history knocks. They learned that time is not a lock, it is a hallway, and sometimes if you keep a light on, what was lost will pass by that light again. Consider the journey, a flake on a sweater's cuff, a breath under a nail, sealed in a room where an overworked technician in 1979 said to themselves, save it. Someday this will mean something. Consider the rooms where, 40 years later, a young tech named Kendra pipetted 12 microlighters into a strip of tubes and checked the cap twice, then 3 times because some days your hands know they are holding a life. Consider a detective who kept a post-it in her locker and refused to treat the word cold as if it meant dead. Cases like this happen not because of miracles, but because of choices, small, accumulative, stubborn choices. On a morning like the one Elena never finished, Marta drove to the field off County Road 18 and parked by the ditch. No ceremony, no cameras. She walked to the place where the ground dips and the maples stand like old witnesses, and she stood for a while with her hands in her coat pockets. Wind picked up dry grass and set it down again. Somewhere not far off, a dog barked twice and then decided that was enough. We heard you, she said, but only in her head. We heard you as soon as we learned how. The file teaches patience. It teaches that evasion is loud and truth is repetitive. It teaches that people who say I never go there 4 times likely went there once, and that this is the only number the world needed to write down. The file teaches, maybe most of all, that remembering is a form of respect. It is not the same as justice, but it is its companion. You might be wondering about the other brother Joel, the one who grilled on Sundays and waved to neighbors. He testified. He said he didn't believe it. He said Ray was difficult, but not dangerous. He said the 70s were a long time ago, and that memories were thin as old shirts. He cried when he said her name out loud. After the verdict, he stood in the parking lot with his daughter and didn't know where to put his hands. Then he put them in his pockets and looked at the sky. Some people, when the world shifts by an inch, feel it as an earthquake. There is a small room in the courthouse set aside for families. It has a couch that has seen every kind of sitting, a box of tissues, and a window that looks out at nothing in particular. Elena's cousin brought a folder there after the verdict. Inside were 10 photographs. Elena at a picnic, Elena with a sparkler on a July night, Elena with a paper crown at a cheap birthday dinner, Elena asleep on a sofa with a book on her chest. They set them on the table in a line. They didn't say much. They looked. Sometimes looking is the point. The diner is still there. The neon light was replaced twice. The counter is new. The owner isn't the man with yesterday's paper anymore. It's his daughter. She keeps, taped under the register where only she can see it, a small photo of a young woman with pinned back hair and a canvas bag. The world, she thinks, is full of private memorials, tiny altars no one else knows they're passing. We tell this story not to celebrate punishment, but to honor persistence, to mark how memory and method can braid themselves together and make something strong enough to pull a name out of a field after 40 winters. We tell it to remind ourselves that silence is not the same as peace, and that justice is sometimes the long echo of a single careful decision made by a stranger who will never know the end of the sentence they began. And that concludes Story 5. The cold case that waited 40 years for science to find the words. From a boy who vanished in daylight, to a killer who walked out in disguise, to a bride who never reached the altar, to a doctor who turned healing into harm. And now, a field that kept a secret until a laboratory learned to listen. If you're new here, I keep my voice calm so you can drift to sleep with these stories or leave them playing quietly in the background. If you want more, you know where I'll be, opening the next file, turning the next page, listening for the next quiet truth. If you've been following along, you know we've been moving carefully, one story at a time, through some of the most unsettling mysteries ever told. From a boy who vanished in daylight, to a killer who walked out in disguise, to a bride who never reached the altar, to a doctor who turned healing into harm, and to a cold case where a field kept its secret for 40 long years until science learned to listen. And now, we step onto the deck of a great ship. The air smells of salt, the sky is wide and endless, and the world seems safe, like a holiday, a dream. But on this journey, something dark waits below the surface. Before we listen, let me pause just for a moment. If you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. It truly helps more than you know. Your support allows me to bring you these stories, long, calm, detailed accounts that you can play in the background, drift off to, or simply sit with as the night grows quiet. And I also love hearing from you. If you want me to speak faster, slower, softer, or even with more energy, just let me know in the comments. I read them all. Alright, let's set sail. This is Story 6, the heiress who vanished on a cruise ship. She was young, wealthy, born into a family that seemed to have everything. Her name was whispered in social circles, written in glossy magazines, and often paired with words like fortune, society, and future. But for all the money, all the attention, she was also lonely. The kind of loneliness that comes not from being without people, but from being surrounded by many, yet never truly being seen. When her parents suggested a cruise, a glamorous voyage across the Caribbean, she agreed. Maybe the sea could wash away that emptiness. Maybe new places, new faces would give her space to breathe. The ship was enormous. It carried hundreds of passengers, staff, performers, and crew. Every deck promised something: champagne at sunset, music in the lounge, polished wood railings that seemed to stretch toward forever. But the ocean also carried secrets. And soon, it would hold one more. At first, everything was ordinary. The heiress walked the decks, danced at dinners, and smiled politely at the many who recognized her. Some envied her, some adored her, some watched her closely. She wrote postcards to friends, she sent letters home, she even bought small souvenirs at the first port stop. Seashell necklaces, a painted scarf, a trinket shaped like a dolphin. Nothing suggested trouble, nothing at all. And then came the night she was last seen. It was late. Music drifted from the ballroom. Couples swayed slowly under crystal lights. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell. The heiress was there too, in a pale dress, her hair pinned with pearls. She danced once, maybe twice. Witnesses later disagreed. Some said she seemed cheerful. Others claimed she looked distracted, as though her mind was far away. Around midnight, she stepped outside, onto the open deck. The sea was black velvet. The moon scattered silver over the waves. A waiter noticed her leaning on the railing, gazing out. And then, the trail vanishes. By dawn, her cabin was empty, her bed untouched. The heiress was gone. Panic spread quickly. The captain was alerted. Announcements were made. Crews searched every corner: kitchens, storerooms, engine rooms, lifeboat stations. Nothing. Passengers whispered. Some feared an accident. Perhaps she slipped. Others murmured darker theories: kidnapping, murder, even a staged disappearance. The ocean, vast and indifferent, offered no clues, only endless waves. Back on land, the investigation began. The cruise line insisted they had done everything possible, but critics argued the search was delayed, disorganized. Detectives pieced together scraps of witness accounts. One passenger claimed he saw her speaking to a man on deck. Another swore she was alone. Surveillance cameras were primitive in those days. The angles missed too much. And so the case dragged on. Her family offered rewards. Private investigators were hired. Newspapers feasted on the story, printing headlines filled with speculation. Yet no body, no evidence, no answers. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some believed she had fallen accidentally, swept away silently into the dark. Others claimed she had been pushed, a victim of envy, obsession, or betrayal. And a few whispered that she had chosen to vanish, escaping the weight of her family's fortune. Each theory had supporters. None had proof. The heiress remained, as one writer called her, the ghost passenger of the Caribbean. And so, even now, decades later, the file remains open. A name, a face, a fortune left behind, and a ship that sailed on, carrying the silence of what happened that night. The ocean keeps its secrets, and somewhere beneath the waves, or lost in memory, lies the truth of the heiress who never returned. And that brings us to the end of story number 6. I still have 5 more chilling cases ready in my hand, but since this video is already getting quite long, I'll pause here for today. If you'd like to hear the rest of these true crime files, let me know in the comments below. Your feedback really helps me decide what to share next. Thank you so much for listening, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because we have plenty more stories waiting to be told. Until next time, stay safe and good night.